Welcome to this week's Talent Talks. My name is Melissa, and I'm your host for today's episode. This is our second literary podcast, and today we want to celebrate Women's History Month by discussing women and female authors who inspire empowerment. So joining us, we have Professor Ted Blake, Professor Susan Winslow, Eddie Landeros, Olivia, our club president, and of course myself. I am the outreach coordinator for the Talent. So since you are our guests, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'll introduce myself. I'm Susan Winslow. I teach English at, I'm officially still at the Menifee campus, but I'll be transferring over to the Temecula campus as of the fall. I've been at the college for, oh my gosh, over 25 years. And I am the faculty advisor for the Creative Writing Club.
Okay, I'll go next. I'm Eddie Landeros. I am the Marketing and Media Specialist for the Career Education Department. I was a student here at MSJC for the communications field, and I helped with the Talent. So I'm very excited to be on the podcast.
Thank you. And Professor Blake?
Oh, sure thing. Yeah, I'm Professor Ted Blake. I'm the Learning Center Coordinator here at Menifee, and I'm also in the English department. I teach literature and composition usually, so it just kind of depends on the semester. I've been here about 15 years, and I'm really excited to share some literature with you all today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, Professor Blake, would you mind starting us off and telling us about the author that you chose?
Sounds great. Well, I'm going to talk about Mary Shelley. She wrote this book, Frankenstein. And if you're going to read Frankenstein, get a good copy. I recommend the Norton Critical Edition because there's all kinds of really cool articles in the back, because the summer of 1816, when she wrote this, she was living in Lake Geneva, on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And that was the year that it was called the Summer Without a Summer. It was basically, and some of you may know this, but a volcano erupted in Indonesia. And a lot of people didn't know this, but it clouded over the sky. So it was very dark, stormy, cold. Some crops failed. There was a lot going on. So it felt like this turbulent time. And it was also, you know, in 1789 was the French Revolution, and that rocked the world of most people from England. They were terrified and fascinated at the same time. And this was also a time of abolitionism in Europe, as well as the optimism about science. And Mary Shelley she puts all this together in this wonderful book. And you asked me to talk about empowerment, and Mary Shelley's life is really interesting because her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a pioneer in the feminist movement. She wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in that, she's advocating for equal rights as well as education for women. And so imagine that's your mother. And her mother is living with William Godwin, who they're both kind of proto-hippies living in England. They don't want to get married, but they're committed to each other in a very passionate relationship. And Mary Shelley is their child. Mary Shelley herself, during this time, ran off with Percy Shelley. She was then Mary Godwin, but Percy Shelley was a poet who's well known in the Romantic period. And she and Percy Shelley are cruising around Europe, journaling. They're taking their time. They're with Mary Shelley's niece, and they meet up with Lord Byron and some other folks at a cottage on Lake Geneva in 1816. And so it's a famous story where somebody suggests they do a ghost story competition. And the reason I want to talk about empowerment with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein is that this book is such a masterpiece, and it comes out of her experience. And when you put all that together, her mother being a feminist, she's a fearless young woman herself. She became more successful than Byron, Shelley, any of the other romantics both commercially, and we're still reading her work when most people don't read those old romantic poets anymore. And I love all that romantic poetry. I highly recommend it. But if you're going to read one thing, you want to choose Frankenstein, because in this book, Mary Shelley gives voice to the person who doesn't fit into society. She really asks this question. And being a woman in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially given what her mom gave voice to, she keenly is aware of that, but she's also using her position to empower others to ask these questions. There's a section in the book where the creature, whose name is not Frankenstein, and I can cover that a little bit in a minute, says, cursed, cursed creator, why did I live? Why in that instant did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? I could with pleasure have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants and have glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. So it's this kind of giving voice courageously to the feeling of someone who doesn't fit in, who's not wanted. And she does, and it's interesting because the creature reads John Milton's Paradise Lost as one of the 3 books that he reads. And that's really significant because in Paradise Lost, John Milton, the character, it's a Christian narrative, right? And the character that's most inspiring and most interesting is Satan in that book, because Satan is the rebel. Satan is the one who was trying to create something. And Mary Shelley gives voice to the creature in a similar way. The creature is kind of both the creator and the destroyer at the same time. And if you think about it, she's talking about womanhood too, because as a woman, she is definitely like biologically going to possibly could produce offspring, right? Sorry to be so scientific about it, but she's very like thinking about these scientific questions because that's how men in science kind of want to label you, right? And so in Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein creates this creature and is immediately, once the creature opens his eyes, and of course Frankenstein, and this seems so typically male, he makes the creature bigger. And maybe that's just like practical because it's hard to work on something small. You don't want to make a little tiny person, but he makes this giant man, And then the second the creature opens his eyes, he rejects it. A mother would never reject her child in that way. That's part of what her point was. And so that like Victor's taking on kind of a feminine role of creation, yet he doesn't know what to do with it. He has no responsibility. He runs away. He's very whiny. The whole story is a framed narrative. But for Mary Shelley to tell this story in the way that she tells it, it's just, you have such empathy for this creature. And the reason it's significant is because the things that the creature faces, people who are, we would call them marginalized, historically underrepresented in certain aspects of society. The creature is really that voice. And to give that voice in a way that people can interact with it, have compassion, is really significant because Victor and the creature, they're tied together throughout the book. They go back and forth. And finally, up in the northern wasteland, as far as the Captain Walton, who's the ship, Victor finally catches up to him and tells him his whole story. The creature has this moment where he's looking at his creator before he disappears into the waste. And I think we have to really question, like, what does society do with people that you've systemically pushed out and systemically disempowered, right? And Mary Shelley's making us really grapple with that question, because the creature, there's no real reason the creature couldn't live, but the creature's also self-aware enough to say, where do I fit in? I want to fit in. I want everything that everybody else has, but for whatever reason in the story, the way she dramatizes the appearance is so shocking that people just can't deal with him. And he does ask for a partner, so it's a very kind of cisgender book in that way. And Victor creates the partner. I don't want to give away everything here to you if you're going to read the book, because I highly recommend it. But Mary Shelley herself is so empowering because she was so successful with this story. She worked it, and because she was so intimate with Shelley and Byron and all these men, the critique of masculinity is just so good in the book. There's so many levels to read it because Victor is such a flawed man. And we can see exactly why. So, Frankenstein it's one of these books, it's a framed narrative, but there's just so much in it that the way she put it through a lens, it makes it possible for people to consider these questions that really were important for the age, especially for women and especially for people who did not have rights at the time, because this all kind of comes together. We can also look at enslavement, which was still legal, but on its way out in England. I think I'm right on the dates on that. England outlawed enslavement much before the United States. But again, Mary Shelley's giving voice to all this, and the fact that we're still reading it is such a compelling story while also hitting all those things is just, she's a genius. What can I say? And she wrote this when she was very, very young. She wrote other books too, notably The Last Man, which I also highly recommend. But check out Mary Shelley. I'll leave it at that because I think I might have been more than 5 minutes. I apologize. That's a lot of info.
That's totally okay. Thank you so much for giving us such a great overview of Mary Shelley's life and her work. I loved hearing this, her critiques of masculinity. That is definitely not an idea that I noticed when I read the book before. But I can absolutely see what you're talking about. And it's interesting that, she is so notable, that her book is so famous, and that when she was during her time, she really kind of got outshined by these other authors. I remember when I heard about Mary Shelley, learning that Percy Shelley was really the one to know back in the era. I'd never even heard of Percy Shelley.
Yeah. As it should be. Mary Shelley's the one. Go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now, and it was first published in 1818. I mean, that's 200 years ago. And to see Frankenstein still be so well known and be used throughout different mediums, like it's incredible. I mean, she really tapped into what it means to be an outcast. So I really appreciate that.
And there's so many different film versions. We didn't even go into that. Film and stage, it remained popular and it still does. There'll probably be another one in a couple of years. It's so deep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and thank you so much for highlighting that idea of giving voice to the monster. Does she refer to him as the monster in the book?
I call him the creature.
The creature, thank you. Yes, giving voice to the creature, to this character who really does represent people who don't have a voice, who may be mistreated or abandoned by Victor, really, and writing him with such sympathy. That is absolutely something that I admire so much about that novel.
Yeah, she critiques the dominant systems of her day, from science to masculinity to politics. There's a lot in the novel that you can trace there.
Well, thank you so much again. Professor Winslow, do you have any thoughts, or would you like to tell us about your author?
Well, I do have some thoughts on Frankenstein. It's one of my favorites. I'm a big fan of Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron. And Ted, you probably are aware of this, but there's a good book which was made into a movie called Haunted Summer. Have you seen that or read that? Yes. So it's basically about the summer where they all meet up in Geneva and decide to write a ghost story. And Mary is the only one who actually finished hers. And unfortunately, Percy and Lord Byron died before they were able to finish. And Ted, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's my understanding that Lord Byron started writing a story that was similar to Dracula about vampires. And it
That was the doctor, Polidori. I think it was his name.
well, I think he found that after Byron died and then published it under his name.
Oh, okay, could be. Yeah.
So if that's correct, then you think about it, that one summer we have really the basis of two of the greatest ghost stories ever that came out of that small group. So yeah, absolutely. So I am focusing on Kate Chopin, who is one of my all-time favorite writers. And most people have never heard of Kate Chopin before. When I talk about her, people say, who? But she is a really essential part of American history. She was born in the middle of around 1850 or so, and lived primarily in Louisiana. And I guess you could say she's an early feminist. She wrote primarily about women being able to choose their paths in life. And a good example would be her short story, The Story of an Hour. And in this story, the protagonist is a woman who's married, and she's told at the beginning of the story, and I'm going to give all sorts of spoiler alerts in here, but she's told at the beginning of the story that her husband has died in a train accident. And she goes into shock for about a minute or so, and then goes up to her room, and her sister and her sister's husband, I believe it's her sister's husband, are there. And the protagonist decides to go upstairs and wants to mourn privately. But as she closes the door, she looks out the window and she sees everything as though for the first time. She's looking out at the tops of the roofs around her. She's listening to what's going on outside, and everything has a different color to it, a different sound to it. And she just starts whispering, free, 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 under her breath. And she thinks back to her husband, and she, I think, feels a little bit guilty that she's feeling this way, but she's realizing that she doesn't have anybody that she needs to live for at that point, that she can live for herself. And a quote from the story is, there would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention make the act seem no less a crime, as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. Now, she also states specifically that her husband was very kind to her and that she had loved him, but she had no control over her life when she was married. I mean, women during that time had no say whether they wanted to get married, whether they wanted to have children or not, whether they wanted to stay single. And Kate Chopin, who was married at that point, she was a widow, and had 6 children, and I think was probably quite happy being a mother of 6 children, realized, though, that this wasn't the life for all women, and they should absolutely have the right to decide whether they want to be independent, whether they want to have children, which is a very prominent theme in her novel, The Awakening, which really centers around a woman, a mother, and her desire to choose the man that she wants to choose instead of the man that she's supposed to choose. and to not have children and to be able to live as a man would, as far as traveling independently, living independently. And these were such shocking themes during her time that she didn't even bother to try to get The Awakening published, because she knew that it wouldn't get published at that time. And so many of her works were banned. And actually, not that long ago, they were also banned because she wrote such shocking stories about women and independence. There's another short story of hers called A Pair of Silk Stockings. And this has a little bit of a different twist on her ideology. It's really about a woman who is unexpectedly runs into a sum of money. And immediately she said, well, I need to buy the children more shoes. I need to do this. Putting everybody before herself. And she goes into a store to buy her children some new clothes and shoes. And she sees a pair of silk stockings and she touches them and she decides, well, I guess I could buy these. And then of course, with silk stockings, she needs to have new shoes, and this kind of continues. And she feels guilty the whole time. It's like, this money is supposed to go to my children. But she continues and she decides that she's going to go see a play, and then she treats herself to a nice meal. And this was completely out of character for her, but it really focuses on just a day in a woman's life who's able to do what she wants to do, to be able to treat herself and spoil herself like she would her children, or like her husband would probably most likely do on any day. And it's just a very, very interesting story about how something so simple to most of us is a big deal to this woman, to be able to buy anything and to be able to go into a restaurant and have a meal by herself and choose what she wants to eat, and go into a play and sit by herself and enjoy this. And this is very typical of Kate Chopin. Not all of her works are around this. Some of them are a little bit more shocking. Honestly, The Storm is a very shocking story and was banned, but it's very powerful. And I don't want to give that one away, but because I really hope that our listeners will indulge a little bit in Kate Chopin. And she's wonderful. Everything about her is wonderful. And she is no doubt my favorite female author.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I had read The Story of an Hour before, and then recently read The Storm and A Pair of Silk Stockings with your recommendation. And I was really surprised at how just captivating they were. I got a page into the story and then I completely forgot that I was even reading a story. I was just so in the moment. And I was really surprised by how strong the feminist themes were. Everything that you mentioned, women, making that choice and being empowered to take care of themselves instead of other people first. So thank you so much for recommending these stories. They were all wonderful. Everyone listening should read them.
I agree. Thank you.
All right. I guess I'll go next if you guys don't mind. I do love Kate Chopin. I love her photos just because it represents that modern literary feeling, that movement that she started. So really cool. And I'm gonna get a little bit more modern with mine. When I was a kid, I was a Navy brat. My dad was in the military. And so we did a lot of moving around. And one thing I loved to do was read. And there was a book series that really helped with all the movement going on and just like the love for traveling. And that was The Magic Tree House, which was written in part by Mary Pope Osborne. Mary Pope Osborne was a brilliant writer. She wrote over 60 books for the Magic Tree House series, and she was a traveler herself. I didn't know this until I started researching it, but she was a military brat as well. She said moving around a lot never caused her any trauma, but staying in one place did. And that is exactly how I feel. You know, getting used to moving around so much, going to different places, it's hard to sit still. And but when I have to, I do like to get my imagination going, and that's what Mary Pope Osborne did with her books. You could sit in your house, read these books, and travel from like to Siberia, to Pompeii, you know, to Egypt, in one sitting. And it was just, I remember being so compelling and such a big part of my childhood when I was reading those. What was incredible about her is that not only was she a brilliant writer, but she was a brilliant program director. You know, she went past the books. The reason why she even created the books was because she was working at a teen homeless shelter, and she saw that these teens didn't have an environment that was really helping them, you know. So she decided that she was going to start writing children's books to help them get their mind somewhere else. You know, it was an outlet for them. And since she was writing for teens, she decided she needed really good cliffhangers at the end of her chapters, you know, to get the teens to keep reading and reading. And that was a big part too. It's like I never wanted to put the books down, and it just got me into reading so much more books. Like it got me into the Harry Potter series, to Lord of the Rings, series of unfortunate events, and I would have never read so much, especially one sitting, if it wasn't for those books. Yeah, and before I move on to my next artist, I'll share just how she started becoming an author. She was a traveler. She went to the University of North Carolina, and she went on this expedition afterwards where she was going with a team through 11 countries: Iraq, Iran, India, Nepal, just a whole journey. And on the journey, she got blood poisoning, so she was hospitalized. And while she was hospitalized, she read the Lord of the Rings series. And from then on, she said it just really changed her life. It changed her perspective on a lot of things, and decided that she was going to seek new adventures. She met her husband, who was in the theater, and she started working multiple jobs. Like she worked for a children's magazine, she worked as a bartender, a teacher, so on and so forth. And eventually she just wrote her first book about her own experiences, and that took off. And she realized that a lot of her journey, her experiences, and what she was interested in, she was able to put on paper and express it. And teens, adults, everyone, they were really ready to connect. So just really appreciated hearing about her history, and knowing, you know, just the meaning behind those books, because they mean a lot to me as a kid. So and then the other author I wanted to share, that she is just like probably my favorite human being of all time, is Maya Angelou. I read Even the Stars Look Lonesome, which is a collection of works that she had. I remember seeing the art book for it. I knew I wanted a Maya Angelou book, and it was a beautiful purple hardcover book. So that just got my attention right away. So bought it. And this was when I was an adult. So I had already been to college and already been in the military, and reading was kind of like beat out of me. I did not want to read anymore. Textbooks were just like overwhelming. I just skimmed through a lot of articles, so I was not the biggest into reading anymore. And when I saw that book, I was just so interested in it because I love her poetry work. And when I decided to pick it up and read it, I couldn't put it down. Like that was the first book that really got me back into reading as an adult, because she talks about a collection of adult experiences, you know, what she's been through in life. She talks about going to Africa. She talks about being an educator, or being Black. African American, and there was just so much content on there. And the way that she writes is that she's not trying. It's just that she's just literally thinking what she's going to put on the paper, but just is so sophisticated, and just so well written that it rolls off the tongue. It's just easy on the eyes, and I just fell in love with it. And so from then on, I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is her best work ever, and is just incredible to share something like that and to like unravel it slowly. Again, just like a brilliant writer. And I just hope to be somewhere like just like an inkling close to that kind of writing skills. But yeah, Maya Angelou really really inspired me to pick up a pen again and to read. And I'm just super thankful for that, thankful for her work. So yeah, both those authors, one was in childhood, inspired me, and then one was in adulthood. And I appreciate, Melissa, you for letting us share our favorite authors here.
Thank you so much for sharing, Eddie. I loved the Magic Tree House growing up, and they absolutely inspired this wanderlust in me. I mean, I was maybe 7 or 8 when I started reading them. And yeah, so I absolutely devoured them. As I showed you before, I have Summer of the Sea Serpent. I actually have a couple of other books. So I definitely think that they sparked an intellectual interest in the history and travel that they involve, for sure.
And I was sharing with y'all how many I read to my kids, and they were right at the age where they could start reading them themselves, which was fun. So I'd pick one up and read it, and they'd read theirs. And I've still got a box of them. I'm saving them to read to my grandkids and have them read. So those are really great. And you know what's also cool about Mary Pope Osborne is she wrote these. It was a great avenue to get into the history of something. Like I remember Earthquake in the Early Morning, there was a companion book all about history of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So it was a great open door to really learn about the background, not only telling a great story with cliffhangers and really that, anybody can relate to, but just the historical background. She really was an author who cared a lot, you could tell.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, right on that.
So good one.
I agree. I also read these, probably the whole series, at least that I don't know if they're still being written, but to my son when he was younger. And it was a great way to end the day with the series. And Maya Angelou, I mean, what more can you say about her? She is the best.
Thank you very much.
Well, Olivia, would you like to share your author with us?
Absolutely. I've just been kind of listening, taking notes. I have so much to read now. But I really enjoy actually following up after Eddie, because you were discussing, childhood and what, now that you're an adult, what you have read and what has got you into that. And actually what I wanted to discuss is kind of a mix of that. It's a book about childhood and going into adulthood. And that is the novel Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And I know that it's kind of obvious, the book is titled Little Women, but I thought it would be a great novel to discuss both the novel itself and the author. Louisa May Alcott was an abolitionist, a women's suffragist, and a nurse during the Civil War. And a lot of aspects of her life actually are in the novel, which I really appreciate. And she was one of the first women to vote when women could vote in Concord. So I thought that was pretty interesting, looking into her life itself and kind of how you could see that within the novel. But looking into the novel, Little Women, the novel shares the story of the March sisters. There's 4 of them. And what I really like about it is just how unique they are. They have unique personalities and different passions. And I think that can be reflected. I have a sister myself, so I always come to this novel and appreciate the relationship with family in that regard. But I do think this book is quite inspiring for women's empowerment. You see a variety of young women interacting with the community, with family. And I think the little aspect of the women in the title is more so endearing than what you would naturally think. A little woman is kind of a negative connotation, but I see it in this sense as very endearing, empowering. It's appreciating these daughters and these sisters as they're growing up. And I think calling them little women itself rather than girls is also empowering, as they are young. They're young teenagers, but they are growing up and they are young women. And so we do see the interactions of these sisters, and flaws included, which I think shows appreciation for the chaos of the interactions, both with the sisters and other women and men, of course, too. But I think what's so empowering is each of these women show that not all women are the same. And there's a lot of beauty in seeing these relationships between the family and the friends that grow, such as with Lori or Lori's grandfather. But another thing I also wanted to point out was the strong matriarchal figure, Mrs. March or Marmee. She's very secure and such an admirable example for the sisters. And there's a lot of deeper discussions, as much as it is childhood, about pride, about class, about moral capability and rumors and all that. So I think as much as you can read this when you're younger, there is a lot that you can take away from as you do get older, and a lot that we can learn from, especially Mrs. March, which I do appreciate. And although this piece was written a long time ago, I do see a lot of beauty and appreciation that can be taken from the book. There are themes of romance with Joe and Lori, and so on, but we also see one of the main characters, Jo March, who struggles with what it typically means to be a woman, especially at the time, and what it really means to be feminine. And Jo shows what's considered unconventional, quote unquote, at the time, and also the strength that comes with, being herself and really reshaping what a woman's identity can also look like. And it really, I think, shows more so themes of independence and identity and relationships in that sense. And I don't know if anyone's seen the newer adaptation, the movie, but I really enjoy the interaction between Lori and Jo in the sense that they kind of exchange the typical gender associations. Even in their wardrobe, sometimes they swapped off in certain scenes, whether it was a blouse or a vest or something. But I did really enjoy seeing that character as well in the movie, because it really expanded not only what it meant at the time, but also how we can learn from that today, what we can really make of our identity. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I enjoy coming back to this book. I think there's always something I find in it new. I'm actually going through it again just because I was like, oh, I should read this again, see if it sparks anything new. And actually, one of the things that stood out to me was the quote, "Never get tired of trying and never think it is impossible to conquer your fault." And I think that is still something that anyone can take away from.
Sure. I think it's interesting just hearing about Louisa May Alcott, Kate Chopin, Mary Shelley, these writers that have just stood the test of time. And I think books, more specifically, out of any form of media, they just really, really have things that will always churn new experiences and touch a new reader in no other way. Just because it is just text on paper and it sparks so much imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you.
I think all of these female authors were trailblazers, really. I mean, you look at Mary Shelley and really taking after her mother, Ted, as you mentioned, and Kate Chopin writing from the perspective of a woman who really had no rights. And then Louisa May Alcott just writing that powerful story, not only, as you said, of sisterhood, but just on life and independence. And I love the fact that a lot of it's very autobiographical. And I feel very lucky because I was able to visit her house a few years ago. And maybe this summer I'll go back and visit her house also in Massachusetts. It's a pretty powerful location there.
That's so cool. I've never heard of that before. That's awesome.
It's right. I don't know if you're familiar with Henry David Thoreau and his work, Walden's Pond. It's right there. So they were all contemporaries. They all knew each other. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and just to touch on what Eddie said, I definitely think that, the stories of all these authors speak to the power of the written word and how empowering it is to write your story or to write stories inspired by your own experiences. Especially, these stories, like we were talking about Kate Chopin, some of her works weren't even published while she was alive because they were banned or because they were considered too scandalous. So to see that their work has continued on and that it still inspires us is really amazing.
Kate Chopin at her time was almost dismissed as a writer because of her themes. And it took many years actually for the literary world to realize what an amazing writer she really was, which I'm grateful for.
Well, before we go, I did have a couple of pieces that I wanted to discuss as well. So I wanted to talk about a couple of memoirs. They are some of my favorite books of all time, and they are Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman and Educated by Tara Westover. These are some more contemporary works, but I think that they are qualified as literature as well as anything else is. So both of these authors came from extremely sheltered or isolated households and communities, and I'll offer just a quick summary of their stories. But of course, their backgrounds are more complex than this. So Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman tells her story as someone who was born into a Hasidic Jewish community in the neighborhood of Williamsburg in New York. She was married in a traditional arranged union, but eventually she did go to college and she was divorced then and wrote her highly successful memoir. Her story has been adapted to a Netflix miniseries, which you may have watched, and it does deviate from the memoir itself, but it still captures a lot of the themes of her story. Then, as far as Educated goes, Tara Westover was born into a fundamentalist Christian family, which grew increasingly radical. She was homeschooled, but later on, she was encouraged to go to college by one of her older brothers. And college offered her a way to escape her home, which was really a severely unhealthy environment. So we get to see how both of them struggle through these transitions, how their worldviews change, and how they have to disconnect from their families and really have to become self-sufficient. I think a major theme in both of these memoirs is empowerment through education, especially in the context of women who are breaking away from oppressive homes or communities. And they are stories from people whose voices have been silenced or have tried to be silenced, speaking of these themes of how Professor Blake mentioned in Frankenstein, the creature is being given a voice and someone who is being, otherwise ignored or misrepresented is being given a voice. I think that really speaks to this idea of people who are sharing their story, who otherwise might be quieted by their community or by traditional gender roles. And I think that there is so much power in the representation that they offer. I think that they represent so many women who really need to hear that someone else who came from a similar situation still flourished. And I think that they offer empowerment through hope and through their astonishing independence. And I just wanted to share a quick quote from Unorthodox with you that I think really captures the essence of the memoir. I could never go to, excuse me. Wow, Hugo, you can cut that out. I could never go to college, I know. They censored the word out of our textbooks. education leads to nothing good. This is because education and college is the first step out of Williamsburg, the first in the path to promiscuity, an endless loop of missteps that distance a Jew so much from God as to put the soul into a spiritual coma. Yes, education could kill my soul. Yeah, so that's unorthodox and educated, and I would encourage anyone to read those stories because I think they are so empowering.
Yeah, I read Educated, great book. I think that Tara does a great job of capturing what it's like to experience ignorance and to overcome like the challenges that she had to face. Like I remember even just simple things she didn't realize, you know, washing her hands after going to the bathroom was common etiquette, and she was looked weird at that way, to severe distress where she was getting beaten by her brother. There was abuse going on, and all she could do was just laugh in the face of it, because if she did anything else, she would be abused even more. And I think it speaks true to not only being in those kind of environments, but to being a woman as well. You know, where you feel helpless in these situations. But what she does so eloquently is that when she finally does get to the place of education, she does get out of that that abusive environment, and that sheltered environment. She uses the strength that she built, you know, the overcoming those challenges. She uses that strength in her new world to progress even further, to go to the University of Cambridge and educate herself even more and do it for herself, and to see like her interviews and to see like what she put in that about her family. She really took a lot to do that, and I applaud her for that, really.
I also read Educated, and that was a rough read. It really was. It was hard getting through that, just the brutality and the circumstances that she had to go through. But I'm glad I did, and I'm glad that she was able to finish her education at the end. And I put Unorthodox on my wish list on Audible. I've heard of the series, but I haven't read the book, so it's on a very long list of books that I want to read. So thank you for talking about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we forget just how valuable an authentic voice is, whatever is being written or said. You know, I have to go teach a class in a minute, but it made me think of, you know, what would Mary Shelley have written about today, you know, if she had that freedom? And she had a lot of freedom, actually. She was a rebel, and she was traveling around before they ended up at Lake Geneva with Percy, and they co-wrote a book together. It's a great little book called A 6 Weeks Tour. But, you know, I was going to say, you know, Mary Shelley humanizes the creature in Frankenstein and refuses to make him a stereotype or a monster. And that's really what any authentic voice gives you. It's a way to combat stereotypes, to empower. Just the saying of those words, whether you agree with it or not, you can't deny the authenticity there. And that's an important part of empowerment, is seeing that your voice is just valuable enough to put it down. Because in Mary Shelley's day, women didn't have the right to vote. They couldn't, it was rare to own property. You know, there were all these things where they were not fully human. And as we define it today, and it's been unfortunately such a long journey to get to that point, but that's really, I think, very important. And what you brought up, Melissa, in those books is really, really key. You know, those voices. Maya Angelou did it so well too, and so did Kate Chopin and Louisa May Alcott. You've got to write that authenticity, and that in and of itself is valuable enough, because we get into all these debates about literary merit and X, Y, and Z. But if it's authentic, it's valuable. It should be out there, and that's empowering.
Thank you so much. I think you phrased that beautifully. Well, do we have any final thoughts before we go?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly kind of say with all of this, I think a lot comes from just what we can derive from text, what we all see from text, whether that's objectively or subjectively, is there is a lot of power and positivity for the most part, and growth that can come from reading something, coming back and reading it again. Is there's always something to learn, there's always something to grow from it. And I think especially with this topic of looking at authors who inspire empowerment in Women's History Month, is that, you know, a lot of great works came from women authors. And I think now, going back and looking at historical works as well as modern works, there's always going to be sort of that growth, improvement, and the importance of text moving forward.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Well, I think that you and Professor Blake wrapped that up really wonderfully and really did a great job of summarizing our thoughts on this discussion. Thank you so much to our listeners, and thank you so much to our guests, Professor Blake, Professor Winslow, and Eddie, for being here. And yeah, well, Hugo, you can cut out this gap too.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. You can find us online at msjctalonnews.com, and you can find us on all social media at msjctalon. Okay, I think we're good to stop recording.